So we are actually now in our 8th Sunday of meeting remotely, and as we're closing in on 2 months of social distancing, I have talked to and prayed with a handful of men in our congregation who have had the unfortunate experience of being furloughed or being laid off. A lot of them are dusting off the old resume and getting ready to send them out. Some of them already even have started trying to apply to the few places that are open. And maybe there are also some spouses out there who haven't had to work outside the home, but now you too are struck with the potential possibility of having to help bring in more money. Maybe the thought of pulling out your resume and updating your credentials has crossed your mind as well. The thing about resumes, of course, is they're only current when you're applying for jobs. Once you have a job, it sort of gets filed away, and then over time, you acquire more experience, things change, maybe your work relationship changes, and you acquire additional training or take different responsibilities since you last updated it. And for my part, since the last time I had to apply for a job, I have finished seminary, I have gained roughly 6 more years of experience in ministry, and I could now even put interim senior pastor on it. But all those things only really matter if you don't know me. If you know me, you might not care nearly as much about my level of education or my experience. And indeed, I haven't updated my resume because you guys aren't still checking on my credentials. You know me, and I know you. But that wasn't always the case. My last job interview, of course, was here at Tomball Bible Church almost 6 years ago to the day. And I remember that whole process very fondly. In my recollection, it was done very well. And one of the most memorable parts of the whole thing was leading worship on a Sunday morning and then coming back in the afternoon for an ice cream social and Q&A, as we are wont to do. The church has changed a good deal since that time, but one thing that hasn't changed is that when given the opportunity in a public forum, our dear friend Tom Munnerlin will ask questions. And those moments are wonderfully endearing to me now. But back then, I didn't know Tom, and Tom didn't know me. And after fielding a few softball questions about worship style and instrumentation and things like that from other people, I mentioned that I'm classically trained and have a degree in music from LSU. Credentials, right? So then Tom asks a question. He looks at me and he asks, so of the 3 Bs, which is your favorite? And I'm like, huh? That question threw me off for a couple of seconds because it seemed a very out of left field question. We were talking about worship, we were talking about instruments, hymns, those sorts of things. And like I said, I casually mentioned I'm classically trained, and hand goes up, Of the 3 Bs, but it clicked, and I remembered my training, my credentials. He was asking who I liked best out of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. I think we have a picture of that. Yeah, there they are. These are 3 huge figures in classical music. And at first, I kind of wondered if this was just like a gotcha question to see if I really knew my stuff. But of course, now that I know Tom, I know that it wasn't at all. See, Tom himself knew something about classical music. And in his brain, he's going, I don't know you, but I know this thing about classical music, and I want to hear your take on this. And it was a genuine question from one person to another about classical music. That it was to help locate my sense of style and a preference. And although I thought about saying, well, it's a toss-up between Biggio and Bagwell, I answered truthfully and said, it's got to be Beethoven. Then, as now, Beethoven rules. And we can get into that offline later, but he's definitely the right of the 3 Bs, one to like. But in that moment, I recognized it. These people are vetting me. They see promise in what I'm saying, but they want to know if I'm the real deal. But they are only measuring me by what they know, because that's all they can do. The 3 Bs, while interesting, has come up exactly twice since I've been at Tomball Bible Church. The first time was at that ice cream social, and the second is right now during this sermon. Many more important questions have been asked of me since, some of them by Tom Munnerlin. And I love you, Tom, if you're listening. And the same thing is happening to Jesus in today's passage in chapter 7. In fact, it was happening last week too. Jesus has been standing before everyone and teaching them in the temple, and they are amazed that Jesus is a common laborer, right? He's Joseph's son. He's a carpenter, not someone who studied under the tutelage of a famous rabbi. And today, we will see that they will judge Jesus by what they think they know about the Messiah. Because they are starting to feel, based on how Jesus is talking, that he could be the guy. But they're going to go, well, wait, what about this? Wait, where did you say you were from? And in that moment of double take, Jesus is again going to seize the opportunity to proclaim his sonship of the Most High God. And then the response of the Jewish leaders we'll see to that claim. So let's look at our text this morning. This is John 7:25 through 36. I will read the text in its entirety. It will also be on your screen, and then we'll begin to take it in pieces. So beginning of verse 25, some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, "Is not this the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? But we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from." So Jesus proclaimed, as he taught in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him. They said, "When the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done?" The Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Jesus said, "I will be with you a little longer, and then I am going to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come." The Jews said to one another, "Where does this man intend to go, that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach Greeks? What does he mean by saying, 'You will seek me and you will not find me,' and 'where I am, you cannot come'?" May God bless today the reading and the hearing of his holy word. So obviously we are still in the temple, and Jesus is still teaching. As Brett showed us last week, we're likely now in the middle of the Feast of Booths, because Jesus went up in about the middle of the Feast of Booths, and this is the same moment, the same discourse that's happening in the temple courts. Jesus has always attracted attention of all of those around him, from the common people to Jewish leaders, and that is still the case here. And last week we saw that Jesus had just finished answering two groups of people. The first group was the Jewish leaders, who are amazed at his uncredentialed intellect. Yet they want to kill him for what he claims about himself, that his teaching is not his own, but directly from the Father. The second group is the crowd, the muttering masses, the ones who are whispering to themselves, trying to not have the Jewish leaders hear about who Jesus might actually be. Is he actually the Messiah? But many of the crowd, they accused him of having a demon, because he claimed rightly that the Jewish leaders wanted to kill him. And once Jesus answers them, we pick up in verse 25, and we notice that a new group is speaking. There's a delineation. You might not notice it at first glance, but in verse 25 it says this: "Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, 'Is not this the man whom they seek to kill?'" So the new phrase, the new group, is some of the people of Jerusalem. They ask the next question. This is not the crowd as a whole, which is mixed with Jews from all over the land, right? The Feast of Booths is a gathering feast where everybody comes from all over to come to Jerusalem. But this is some of the people of Jerusalem, people that are locals. And they are aware of the Jewish leaders' plot to kill Jesus, probably more than people from outside the region of Judea. And if we think about it, this makes sense. They're far more likely than the Galileans and other pilgrims to know the minds and the machinations of the Jewish political landscape, of all of the Jewish authorities. Sure, some of the crowd naively doubted that anyone was trying to kill Jesus in verses 19 and 20. These people, though, they knew better because they had heard that that was happening. And what seems to have taken them by surprise was the bold and public nature of Jesus' proclamation, even in the midst of such a threat. Verse 26, the next verse, sheds light on this. It says, "And here he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ?" But if Jesus' boldness in speaking publicly is surprising to these Jerusalemites, what is no less surprising is the silence of the Jewish leaders. They're going, wait a minute, isn't this the guy that they said they wanted to kill? And here he is just talking, and they're not doing anything to stop him. And literally their offices are like right down there. This is one of those moments where you really get the sense that these people are all just spectators kind of watching some intense moment play out. The Jerusalem people, more in the know than the pilgrims, are waiting to see what's going to happen and trying to fill the gap in their knowledge about Jesus. They're saying, okay, these guys definitely don't like Jesus and want to kill him. And yet, no effort is being made by the rulers to apprehend him and stop his teaching. So it's no wonder that they're confused. No wonder that they ask the question which immediately follows, have our rulers changed their mind? Are they convinced at last? Have they really found out that this is truly the Messiah, the Christ of God? And it's noteworthy in John's gospel that this is the first time that such a possibility has ever been articulated in Jerusalem, that Jesus might actually be the Messiah. Sure, people have been wowed by his miracles that he's worked in Jerusalem. We've seen that already in John. But in John's gospel, this is the first time that there are actually people from Jerusalem that are saying, this guy might be the guy. It's one thing to have a bunch of Galileans try and crown you as king. It's another to sit and teach in the temple with the big boys and them do nothing to stop you. But the possibility, however, is dismissed almost immediately. In the same breath of the mere suggestion that Jesus is truly the Messiah, they dismiss it. Look at verse 27. It says, "But we know where this man comes from. And when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from." So even the people of Jerusalem at this point knew that Jesus was from Galilee, whereas the Messiah was to be a native of Bethlehem. They bring this up in verse 42, which is going to be discussed next week. But there's also another different idea that's less familiar to the ears of the Christian. According to some rabbinic traditions, the Messiah is completely of unknown origin until he appears. Likely, those that are speaking here at this moment are actually articulating this view. No one will know where he's from when the Messiah appears. In this tradition, the Messiah would be born of flesh and blood, yet would be wholly unknown until the time that he appears to immediately bring about Israel's redemption. Early church father Justin Martyr explained this view in his dialogue with Trypho around AD 155. He says, writing to Trypho, who is a second-century Jew, he says this. He says, "You suppose that Christ, if he has indeed been born and exists anywhere, is unknown and does not even know himself and has no power until Elias," that's Elijah, "comes to anoint him and make him manifest to all." So Justin Martyr is actually articulating this viewpoint that was common in the first and second century about the Messiah, that the Messiah is going to spring from a completely unknown origin, and he's not even going to know himself. As Christians, many of us are probably not even aware that this was one of the competing messianic viewpoints of the day, that even the Messiah himself would not know. But Jesus is clearly testifying that he is the Christ, that he is the Messiah, so Jesus doesn't seem to fit that criteria. Remember, again, we're kind of looking at credentials. And we as Christians know Jesus and his parents have always known that he is the Christ. So he is an unknown, and as far as the people in Jerusalem are concerned, they know where Jesus comes from, Nazareth in Galilee. And now his family home is somewhere near Capernaum, right? And he had been engaged in itinerant ministry all around Galilee, sometimes in Jerusalem, for some time now. And, of course, he had been engaged about the kingdom of God, about being the Messiah. So, of course, John is laying down a bit of irony to show that the people of Jerusalem are not as informed about Jesus' true origins as they think. But this is them continuing to judge his credentials, right? The Jewish Messiah is supposed to be X, Y, and Z. You aren't X. You're just Y and Z. That's the way that they're kind of thinking. And Jesus likely overhears this, and so we get his response in the next verse. It says, "So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, 'You know me, and you know where I come from? But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know.'" And so this verse right here is interesting for a few reasons. First, we have the word proclaim here, and that's from the Greek word krazo, which literally means to cry out. You can actually even hear some of the Greek influence on the word cry. Krazo means to cry out. So we have to understand that Jesus is actually making a public pronouncement here. He's not continuing to just teach quietly in the temple. He's actually crying out. So he's saying, "You know me." We have to understand that in John's gospel, this is always how this word is used. So Jesus is raising his voice here above the rabble, above the muttering, to say something, to speak directly to what they're saying. Second, we have Jesus' actual answer. "You know me, and you know where I come from." Read this way, it seems as if Jesus is giving credence to their point, like he's acknowledging a certain soundness to their judgment of him, even though his next statement demonstrates that they know less about his origins than they think. So alternatively, and probably more likely, the words could easily be read, and I would say should be read, ironically. It is probably best thought of as a question. "You know me, and you know where I'm from?" That's the tone in which you should probably take from Jesus. And remember, these early Greek manuscripts, there's no punctuation in them. Often there's not even spacing between the words. You have to they're all written in all capital letters, and you have to pull them out, and then that stuff gets added later. So here, "You know me, and you know where I'm from?" Just one chapter later, Jesus himself kind of verifies this line of reasoning for us. In John 8:19, it says, "They said to him, 'Where is your Father?' And Jesus answered, 'You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also.'" And this is part of a relatively short time later, still in Jerusalem. So Jesus is in fact saying, "You don't actually know me." He's questioning if they know him. So here we're getting a little bit, not of the historical Jesus, but of the rhetorical Jesus. That is, Jesus employing a rhetorical device to illustrate his point. He's using irony. "You know me, and you know where I'm from. Sure you do. But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know." The second statement is Jesus' real answer to the question. The word "true" here could lend itself to some misinterpretation, right? "He who sent me is true," particularly in light of John's frequent use of the word truth in his gospel. But Jesus is not saying that God, the one who sent him, is true as in that he's faithful, but that he is real. Jesus' point is not that God exists, though, because no one really is doubting that. That's not the issue at hand. But that God, as the one who sent him, is real. Or in modern language, he is really the one who sent Jesus, regardless of what the people of Jerusalem think about Jesus' origins. Jesus is saying, "My origins are more unknown than you even think. I'm sent from God." He is in effect saying, "You think you know me and where I'm from, but you don't. I am really from God, and I am God, and you don't know me because you don't know Yahweh." So Jesus continues in verse 29, reinforcing this and his own knowledge of the Father, which is true knowledge, unlike the crowd and the Jewish leaders. In verse 29, it says, "I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." So this accusation that only Jesus knows the Father had to have been deeply offensive, particularly to the Jewish leaders who painstakingly obeyed the law of Yahweh. But the law, Jesus has already insisted, points to himself. We remember this from chapter 5, verse 46. Jesus says, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." So if the Jews don't realize who Jesus is, it must be that they don't really understand the law. They don't really know the God who gave the law, because if they did, they wouldn't have rejected his son. Jesus, on the other hand, does know God. In fact, he knows him uniquely as his son. And now that Jesus has come, sent by the Father, his very presence serves as a litmus test of previous claims about knowing God, about knowing who God is. The implication here is that those who recognize who Jesus really is do know God. But it also means the opposite, that those who cannot discern who he is can't possibly know God, especially not when the very focal point of God's great divine self-revelation is the incarnate Son, the Word made flesh, standing before them in that very temple, his own temple. So putting all this together, the main sort of Christological idea, the main thrust about Jesus, about Christ, at this point in John's Gospel is very similar to Matthew's point in Matthew 11:27. Jesus says, "All these things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." We take this for granted a little bit today as Christians. Obviously, lost people don't know Jesus. But if we want to help somebody discern if he or she really knows God or not, like a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu or even a Jewish person, we present them with Jesus Christ, the Jesus Christ of the Bible, the Son of God crucified on a cross in the place of sinners. We present him as the only hope for the world. And what they make of that, what they make of Jesus, reveals whether or not they truly know God. If they will not have Jesus as Lord and Savior, then they do not have God as Father. That is what Jesus is saying. And then in verse 30, the response is obvious. So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Now, we heard about this a little bit in the children's video. So Jesus says what he's been saying all along, the fact that he's the Messiah, and more than that, he is the Son of God, sent from the Father. And if you reject him, you don't know God. This is the thing that has continually stirred up the Jews. This is why some in the crowds want to arrest him. But now, it wasn't the divinely appointed time for Jesus to be arrested, right? We dealt with this 2 weeks ago when we talked about the difference between Jesus saying it's not the right time for me to go to the feast versus it's not the hour for my crucifixion. Because what will precede his crucifixion? Arrest. So this is important to notice. Jesus is poking in on a lot of the same things that will eventually lead to his arrest. In fact, it will happen at Passover in about 6 months' time from where we are now. But the difference is, apparently, that it is not yet part of God's sovereign plan to do so. Can't happen yet. So while there are calls to arrest him, and some might actually think that he is the Messiah, this doesn't actually go anywhere. Look at the next verse. Yet many of the people believed in him. They said, "When the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done?" Now, it's hard to say whether these people had any deep understanding of the significance of these signs, leading them to a better understanding of who Jesus actually was, or whether it's more along the lines of the belief that we've seen in John before, again, hearkening back to chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, which we've mentioned over and over again, these idea that people saw Jesus' miracles and they believed in him, but Jesus didn't entrust himself to them because it wasn't the kind of belief that is saving belief. It was just, yes, we believe that you can do those things and we're very interested in what you have to say, but there was no staking their life on any of his claims. But those that believed in Jesus only because of his signs and miracles might not be what's in view here. It's hard to know. Popular messianic understanding didn't necessarily associate the Messiah with miracles. And we've already seen there's kind of factions and disagreements about what the Messiah would do and who he was going to be and how he was going to act when he appeared. But most people thought and associated the Messiah with a political revolution and deliverance, particularly of the Roman oppressors. But average Jews often sort of conflated or brought together in their minds the Messiah and the eschatological prophet, the prophet in the end times that will show up and will do lots of miracles. That's why they would ask Jesus often in the Gospels if he were the prophet or Elijah, because they're trying to read out the list of credentials and trying to see where Jesus fits. Are you this thing? This guy that's coming, or are you something else? So they ask the question, will the Christ do more signs than this guy does? But still, there is some evidence that these Jews may have actually believed in the same way that you and I believe, as in saving belief in Jesus as the Son of God, not just a wonder worker. In chapter 8, which takes place within this same sequence of events just a little bit later, we get this. This is 8, verse 31. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples." So Jesus is not saying, I can't entrust myself to you. You're not believing in the right way. He's saying, if you really believe in me, you are going to live by my message. You're going to orient your life around it. So I tend to think that at least some of this crowd is genuinely putting their faith in who Jesus is. And when the Pharisees got wind of this positive response in verse 32, it says they took action. It says, the Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. So now it's not just people crying out to arrest him or trying to lay hands on them. It's actually the Pharisees themselves and the chief priests sending officers to arrest him. So that Brett talked about last week, that's the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees were a minority faction within the Sanhedrin, which was likely mostly Sadducees, but they didn't agree on a lot, but they both agreed that what Jesus was saying was trouble. So, sometimes enemies make strange bedfellows. They were both ready to say, ooh, we need to arrest this guy, because he's stirring up trouble for both of us. So that's what finally does it. Not just that people were hearing about Jesus, but that they were muttering about Jesus being the Messiah. The undercurrent was that Jesus was, at least to some, the Christ. And the Jewish leaders couldn't do nothing about that. They couldn't let that stand, so they sent officers. Now, these were, in effect, temple guards. We've got to remember, they're under Roman occupation, so they don't really carry any authority to exact an execution or anything, but they could at least seize Jesus and bring him before the Sanhedrin. And you'll have to tune in next week to see how that plays out, because John sort of leaves this dramatic tension on the table. We sort of begin to see the machinations in the closed room of, hey, we need to do something about this guy. But in verse 33, it goes back to Jesus. It says, Jesus then said, I will be with you a little longer, and then I am going to him who sent me. And then he continues in 34, you will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. So Jesus, likely seeing or hearing that they were going to try and have him arrested, speaks of his imminent departure. So his words are clear to any reader, especially somebody that's read the entire book of John at least once. His appointed time has not yet come, but the hour is drawing nearer. He has but a short time now before the cross, the means by which he will return to the one who sent him. And death is not for Jesus the end, but the return to the glory that he had with the Father before the world began. In fact, Jesus himself says this in John 17, verse 5. He says, and now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. In the hours heading up to Jesus' death, he knows exactly where he's going and exactly what he's doing. So here we just get a little 6-month preview. He says, in 6 months, I'm headed back to the Father. Once Jesus reached that point, of course, no one can go with him, not even the faithful disciples, because their appointed time to go to the Father had not come. John 13:33 says it this way. Jesus is speaking. He says, "Little children," to his disciples, "yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." So he says that not just to anyone, but even his own disciples. And clearly here, we must understand that he's speaking, therefore, of his death. But once again, Jesus' words are misunderstood. The people are confused. And the Jews, whether the authorities or just all of those in the crowd that opposed him, they think that they know all about his origins, right? And they cannot imagine that Jesus can take himself somewhere where they could not find him if they chose to do so. So we see this in 35 and 36. It says, "The Jews said to one another, 'Where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What does he mean by saying, you will seek me and you will not find me, and where I am you cannot come?'" So let's take these in reverse order. They restate his assertions in verse 36 and ask what they mean. That's clear. But in verse 35, they actually speculate a little bit on his meaning. And of course, they were mocking. I think it's easy to read the tone here. This is sort of an offhand, "And next I suppose you're going to grow wings and fly away, huh, Jesus?" It's that sort of retort. Remember, these are Judean Jews living in the holy city of Jerusalem. They are asking if it's the intention of Jesus, after his work in Judea has obviously ended in disappointment, are you going to just go and teach wherever you can find any Jew amongst the dispersion among the Greeks in various regions of the earth where all of the Jews are now living, among other Gentiles? And when John mentions teaching Greeks here, though, he doesn't just mean Greek-speaking Jews, but people who are not ethnically Jewish at all. And of course, this too is part of the author's sense of dramatic irony, because the plan of redemption for Jesus is not for the Jew alone, but also the Gentile. Because Jesus would die for the sins of the world, not just the sins of the Jew. Commentator William Hendrickson put it this way. He said, "They are asking if it was the intention of Jesus to work among the scattered Jews, and when also this work issued in failure, then labor among the Greeks themselves. They do not realize that what they are saying in derision contains a glorious prophecy. Indeed, the Greeks will take an interest in the gospel, and the tidings of salvation will be spread throughout the earth, and the kingdom of the Lord will be established." And then it feels like we're ending kind of abruptly, because we run out of gas here. We run out of our paragraph. But this is actually the end of this discourse. John gives us no real conclusion, but begins the next paragraph with "the next day," which we'll save for next week, which further picks up some of these dangling threads, but we'll have to save those for next time, Lord willing. So we'll stop here and we'll consider a few things to take away with us. So I want to return to the idea of credentials and qualifications. As we have seen throughout John's narrative, not just today, but throughout the gospel, different Jewish groups, different factions, different regions, all have a list of criteria that they are looking for Jesus to check off, different boxes for him to tick. Jewish leaders want to know how he's so learned if he's never studied. We saw that last week. The Galileans in the wilderness just ate their fill of the loaves and the bread and were ready to make him king. That was all it took for them. Here, some of the people of Jerusalem seem to perhaps genuinely believe that someone who can teach and heal like Jesus might indeed be the Messiah. But Jesus isn't interested in ticking their boxes. He's revealing to them all the new boxes they've never even considered. He's saying, you're looking at the wrong qualifications. My credentials are the same as the one who sent me. Is he good enough for you? Jesus doesn't have any desire to fit inside their tidy little categories that they've constructed for their version of the Christ. Their confusion is so evident, he couldn't tick all their boxes even if he wanted to, because some people want totally opposed things in their Messiah. So that's the first takeaway that I want you to see this morning. So first takeaway, if Jesus doesn't tick all your boxes, you probably need new boxes. Because just like the crowd, you're confused. You need a list, your list of needed credentials is somehow different. And Jesus is saying that all the criteria that matter are fulfilled in him, because only he can reveal the one who sent him. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way. He says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. And after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. The clear, full picture of the Father is found in the Son, and there is no other way to the Father except through the Son. And if your version of Jesus isn't that, it's the wrong version of Jesus. Second takeaway, the time to seek Christ is shorter every day. We remember in verse 34, he says, you will seek me and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. Jesus was basically saying, I'm with you right now, and I'm saying the things that I need to say to you for you to understand. But there will come a time where I can no longer do that for you. That time has, of course, passed for all of us. We are, of course, just reading it, and we are grateful, again, that John has written it down for us as an eyewitness. But this goes deeper. Indeed, for some, this is an implicit threat. This foreshadows a passage from the next chapter where the rebuke moves from implicit to explicit. John 8:21 says this. It says, so he said to them again, I am going away, and you will seek me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come. The time would come when some would look for him, believing the Messiah had still not yet come, failing to realize that they'd already stared him in the face. And they would not find him, and they would die in their sin. And it's chilling to think about. But how much more is that true for those who have heard today and not yet believed? Christ today is where every unbeliever cannot and will never be, in heaven with the Father. But his message, his gospel, has endured through this, through writers like John, the eyewitness, the evangelist, the disciple, the apostle. The message has endured, and his people, his church, is still established. And we are his ambassadors, and we carry the good news of Jesus Christ. Don't die in your sin because you are casually seeking him. But then you hem and you haw once you know all you need to know. It's not about knowing, it's about trusting and believing. Trust in Jesus for your salvation. Believe that he is the Son of God who stood in your place. Psalm 2:12, which Michelle read earlier, it says it this way. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled, but blessed are all who take refuge in him. The time is shorter every day. If you have not trusted Jesus, trust him. Trust him. But for believers this morning, our third and final takeaway is this. Don't fall into the same trap of trying to modify Jesus so that he better fits your criteria. so that he's more to your liking, so that he has the credentials that you think that he should have. Search your hearts this week. Are you believing anything about Jesus or about his message that is sort of self-constructed? Or ignoring parts of Jesus and his message that are uncomfortable, like that his wrath is quickly kindled? As Christians, we must fight this impulse because it's not from God, but our own flesh, which desires to make a God in our own image. And as Christians, we know the truth. The biblical Jesus, the real Jesus, is better than any other version of him. And once we know him, our hearts should ache for him, long for him, and be satisfied only in him, because he is better than any version that we could construct, and is certainly better than anything else that this world has to offer. So let's worship him this morning, and let's pray as we close.